The priest leaves me on my knees on the floor. Father Gabriel was a man who carried his faith like a shield, a symbol of strength and devotion that everyone in the parish admired. At 35, his presence was imposing, yet comforting, his sermons filled with a quiet passion that drew people to him. Among them was me, Lucas, a 23-year-old looking for something he couldn't name. Every Sunday, I found myself watching him, not just listening to his words, but captivated by the man behind the leash. It began as an admiration, an innocent respect for someone who seemed untouchable, but the admiration turned into something deeper, something I couldn't name. And when his eyes fell on mine for a fleeting moment after Mass, I knew I wasn't the only one feeling this way. There was a spark, a silent connection that neither of us could ignore. This is the story of how Father Gabriel and I broke the unspoken rules to find a love that was as forbidden as it was undeniable. Sundays were supposed to be routine. For years I'd gone to church out of habit, sitting in the same pew with my family, half listening to sermons that seemed more like background noise than anything meaningful. But that changed the day Father Gabriel arrived. He wasn't like the other priests we'd had. There was a quiet authority in his voice, a sincerity that made his words feel personal. At 35, he carried himself with a calm confidence that seemed unshakable. His dark hair was always neatly combed, and his piercing hazel eyes held a depth that made it impossible to look away. I was 23, working a monotonous job and trying to figure out my place in the world. Church was never supposed to be a part of that discovery. But every Sunday, I found myself drawn to Father Gabriel, watching him from the pews as he delivered his sermons. At first, I told myself it was just respect. He was an inspiring man, after all. But soon I realized it was something more. It was the way his eyes scanned the congregation, pausing for the briefest moment when they met mine. The way his smile lingered just a little longer when we exchanged pleasantries after Mass. There was a warmth in his gaze that made my chest tighten, a feeling I didn't know how to handle. One afternoon, after most of the congregation had left, I stayed behind. I told myself I had a question about the sermon, but deep down, I just wanted to talk to him. "Father Gabriel," I called softly, my voice echoing in the nearly empty church. He turned, his expression lighting up when he saw me. "Lucas," he said, walking over. "What can I do for you?" I hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish. I just wanted to thank you for today's sermon. It really spoke to me." His smile widened, and for a moment, it felt like the two of us were the only ones in the room. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "That's why I'm here, after all." There was a pause, the air between us heavy with unspoken words. "You seem to stay behind, often," he added, his tone light but curious. "Do you have a special connection to the church?" I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Not really. I just like the quiet. It's peaceful." He nodded, his eyes searching mine. "It is, isn't it? Sometimes I think we all need a little peace." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could feel my pulse quicken, my thoughts racing as I struggled to think of something to say. But before I could, someone called for him from the other side of the church. "I have to go," he said, his expression apologetic. "But it was nice talking to you, Lucas." I nodded, forcing a smile. "You too, Father." As he walked away, I couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. But that moment stayed with me, replaying in my mind over and over. There was something in the way he looked at me, something that made me wonder if he felt it too. The following Sunday, I decided to stay after Mass again. This time I had a real question, something I'd written down the night before just in case I froze again. But before I could approach him, he approached me. "Lucas," he said, his smile as warm as ever. "I was wondering if you'd be interested in joining our young adults group. We're having dinner next week at the parish hall, and I think you'd enjoy it." My heart skipped a beat. "Sure," I said quickly, trying not to sound too eager. "Great," he said. "I'll see you there." The week passed in a blur, my anticipation growing with each passing day. By the time the dinner rolled around, I was a bundle of nerves. The parish hall was filled with familiar faces, but my eyes were fixed on him. He moved through the crowd with ease, greeting everyone with the same warmth he'd shown me. But when he spotted me, his smile seemed to soften, as if it were meant just for me. "Lucas," he said, coming over. "I'm glad you made it." "Thanks for inviting me," I said, my voice steady despite the fluttering in my chest. We spent most of the evening talking, the conversation flowing effortlessly. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just another face in the crowd. He saw me, really saw me, and it made me feel alive. As the night came to an end, he walked me to the door. "I hope you'll come again," he said, his tone sincere. "I will," I promised, my heart racing as our eyes met one last time. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Father Gabriel was more than just a priest. He was a man, one who made me feel things I'd never felt before, and as much as I tried to push those feelings aside, I knew they weren't going anywhere. The dinner at the parish hall marked a turning point. It was no longer just a fleeting connection between us. There was something real, something neither of us could ignore. I found myself staying after Mass more often, lingering in the quiet sanctuary while others left. It wasn't intentional, at least that's what I told myself. But somehow Father Gabriel and I always ended up talking. One Sunday, he surprised me with a question. "Would you like to help me with some of the church's community work?" I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "What kind of work?" "Simple things," he said with a smile. "Organizing food drives, helping with outreach programs. You'd be good at it, I think." It wasn't something I'd ever considered before, but the way he asked made it impossible to say no. "Sure," I said. "I'd like that." Over the next few weeks, I spent more time at the church than I ever had before. Father Gabriel and I worked side by side, sorting donations, planning events, and visiting families in need. It felt good to be a part of something bigger than myself, but it was the time we spent together that I looked forward to the most. The late-night confession. One evening after a long day of delivering care packages, we sat on the church steps, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The world felt quiet, almost peaceful, and for a moment it was just the two of us. "You seem happier these days," he said, his voice breaking the silence. I glanced at him, surprised by the observation. "I guess I am, being here, doing this. It feels right." He nodded, his gaze distant. "It's amazing how much good can come from small acts of kindness. It reminds us of what really matters." There was a pause, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I wanted to say something, to tell him how much his presence meant to me, but I didn't know how. "Father Gabriel," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "Gabriel," he corrected gently. "You can call me Gabriel when it's just us." His words caught me off guard, but they warmed me in a way I couldn't explain. "Gabriel," I said, testing the name on my lips. He smiled, a soft, almost shy curve of his mouth. "What is it, Lucas?" I hesitated, my heart pounding. I want to thank you for everything. You've given me a sense of purpose I didn't know I needed." His eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something there. Something vulnerable, something real. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "You've done just as much for me as I've done for you." His words sent a shiver down my spine, but before I could ask what he meant, he stood, brushing off his hands. "It's getting late," he said, his tone returning to its usual calm. "I should lock up." "Of course," I said, standing as well. "Good night, Gabrielle." "Good night, Lucas," he replied, his gaze lingering on mine for just a moment longer than necessary, the unexpected gesture. The next morning, I arrived at the church to find a small envelope waiting for me on one of the pews. My name was written on it in elegant handwriting, and inside was a simple note. "Thank you for being here. You make this place brighter." My heart raced as I read the words, my mind instantly going to him. It had to be Gabriel. No one else would leave something like this. When I saw him later that day, I couldn't bring myself to ask about the note. Instead, I carried it with me, a secret reminder of the connection we shared. The following Sunday, as I lingered after Mass, he approached me again. "Walk with me," he asked, his tone casual. "Of course," I said, falling into step beside him. We wandered through the quiet streets surrounding the church, our conversation flowing effortlessly. It felt easy, natural, as if we'd known each other for years. But as the walk came to an end, he stopped abruptly, turning to face me. "Lucas," he said, his voice low, "I need you to know something." My heart pounded as I waited for him to continue. "There's a line I can't cross," he said, his eyes searching mine. "But that doesn't mean I don't feel it. The connection between us. It's real, and it's hard to ignore." His words hit me like a tidal wave, leaving me breathless. "Gabriel, He held up a hand, stopping me. "I just needed to say it, to be honest with you. But we have to be careful, for both our sakes." I nodded, my mind racing. "I understand." But as I watched him walk away, I couldn't help but wonder how long we could keep pretending this was something we could control. After Gabriel's confession, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His words replayed in my mind, stirring a mix of emotions I wasn't ready to confront. The connection between us was undeniable, but he was right. There were lines we couldn't cross, yet avoiding him felt impossible. Every time I walked into the church, my eyes sought him out. Every interaction, no matter how small, seemed charged with unspoken tension. And the more I tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. One evening, after a long day of helping with the church's food drive, Gabriel invited me to join him in his office. "I could use your help organizing some files," he said, his tone casual, but his eyes holding something deeper. I followed him without hesitation, my heart pounding as we entered the small, dimly lit room. Stacks of papers and books covered the desk, and the air smelled faintly of old parchment and incense. "Sorry for the mess," he said with a sheepish smile. "I haven't had much time to keep things in order." "It's fine," I replied, trying to ignore the way my pulse quickened in his presence. We worked side by side, sorting through files and documents. The silence between us was comfortable at first, but as the minutes passed, the tension grew. Every accidental brush of our hands, every fleeting glance, felt electric. At one point, he reached for a stack of papers just as I did, and our hands collided. We both froze, our eyes locking. "Lucas," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The way he looked at me, his hazel eyes filled with a mix of longing and restraint, left me speechless. "I can't," he started, but his voice faltered. "Gabriel," I interrupted, my voice trembling. "I feel it too." He closed his eyes as if trying to gather his thoughts. "This isn't right," he said, his tone conflicted. "But I can't pretend it's not there." Before I could say anything else, he stepped back, putting distance between us. "I think we should stop for tonight," he said, his voice steady, but his expression pained. I nodded, my chest tight. "Good night, Gabriel." "Good night, Lucas," he replied, his gaze lingering on mine as I left the room. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he looked at me, the way his voice trembled when he said my name. But more than that, I couldn't ignore the ache in my chest every time I saw him, knowing there was a wall between us we couldn't tear down. One evening a storm rolled in, the rain pounding against the church windows as I worked alone in the parish hall. I'd stayed late to finish organizing supplies for an upcoming event, but part of me hoped Gabriel would appear. As if summoned by my thoughts, he walked in, his expression unreadable. "You're still here," he said, his voice low. "I wanted to finish up," I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. He nodded, stepping closer. "Lucas, we need to talk." My heart raced as he sat down across from me, his eyes fixed on mine. "I've been trying to figure out how to handle this," he said. "What I feel for you. It's not something I expected, but it's there, and I don't know what to do with it." "Neither do I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. The storm outside grew louder, the thunder echoing through the hall. For a moment we just sat there, the weight of our feelings filling the space between us. Finally, Gabriel spoke. "This isn't just about me, Lucas. It's about you too. If we go any further, it will change everything." I swallowed hard, my chest tight. "I know," I said, "but I also know that I don't want to let this go." His eyes softened, and for the first time I saw a hint of a smile. "You're braver than I am," he said quietly. "No," I replied, "I'm just honest about what I feel." Gabriel leaned back, his expression contemplative. "We'll figure it out," he said finally. "Together." As the storm raged on outside, I felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, it felt like we were moving toward something real, something worth fighting for. The days following our conversation felt different. Gabriel and I had reached an unspoken understanding, a fragile truce between what we wanted and the reality we faced. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to ignore the lines we were walking. One quiet evening, Gabriel asked me to join him for a visit to one of the parish's longtime supporters, Mrs. Bennett, an elderly woman who had been unwell. "She loves company," he said with a small smile, "and I think she'll enjoy meeting you." I agreed, grateful for any excuse to spend time with him outside the church. When we arrived at her modest home, Mrs. Bennett greeted us with warmth, her frail frame wrapped in a knitted shawl. Gabriel introduced me, his voice full of affection as he explained how I'd been helping at the church. "You've got a good heart, young man," she said, patting my hand. "The world needs more people like you." We spent hours with her, listening to stories of her youth and sharing laughter over her sharp wit. Gabriel seemed lighter in her presence, his usual solemnity replaced with an easy smile. Watching him like that, I felt a pang of something deeper, a realization that my feelings for him were no longer just admiration. As we left, Mrs. Bennett pulled Gabriel aside, her voice soft but firm. "You take care of him," she said, glancing at me with a knowing look. "He's special." Gabriel didn't respond immediately, but when he turned back to me, his eyes held an intensity that made my chest tighten. That night, as we returned to the church, the tension between us reached a boiling point. Gabriel parked the car and turned to me, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "Lucas," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "What is it?" I asked, my pulse quickening. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the dashboard. "Pretend that what's happening between us isn't real." His words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken for too long. "Then don't," I said, surprising even myself with the firmness in my voice. He looked at me then, his hazel eyes filled with conflict. "It's not that simple." "It is if we let it be," I argued. "Gabriel, I'm not asking you to abandon your faith or your calling. I'm just asking you to be honest with yourself. With me." For a moment he didn't say anything, his expression unreadable. Then with a sigh he reached out, his hand resting on mine. "You're asking me to risk everything," he said softly. "I'm asking you to follow your heart," I replied. The silence that followed was deafening, but in it I felt the weight of his decision. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to mine, his resolve cracking under the weight of what we both knew was inevitable. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then we'll figure it out together," I said. Gabriel didn't respond right away, but his hand tightened around mine, a silent acknowledgement of the path we were about to take. As we sat in the car, the world outside felt far away, the storm of emotions between us the only thing that mattered. "I don't know where this will lead," he said finally, "but I can't keep pretending it doesn't exist." "Neither can I replied. That night as we parted ways, there was a sense of something shifting between us. The lines we'd been so careful not to cross were beginning to blur, and for the first time it felt like we weren't running from it. But with every step forward, I knew we were heading into uncharted territory, a place where love and faith collided in ways neither of us had ever imagined. It happened on a quiet evening in the church garden. The stars were out, and the world felt still, as though it was holding its breath for us. Gabriel and I sat side by side on a wooden bench, the space between us electric. "I've never been this scared," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Me neither," I admitted. He turned to me then, his hazel eyes searching mine. "But I'm more afraid of letting this go." Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, in a kiss that was both tentative and full of conviction. In that moment, the world faded away, leaving only us and the undeniable truth of what we felt. Our relationship wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, of questioning if we were doing the right thing. But with every challenge, we found strength in each other. Gabriel remained true to his faith, balancing his role in the church with the love we shared. It wasn't conventional, but it was real. One evening as we walked hand in hand through the garden, he stopped and turned to me. "I've spent my life preaching about love," he said, "but I didn't truly understand it until you." Tears filled my eyes as I smiled at him, and I never thought I'd find it here. In a place where faith and love intertwined, we built a life together. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts. Love comes in many forms, and it often finds us when we least expect it. What does love mean to you? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more stories that touch the heart.